Boy Scout Troop 453, Eagan, Minnesota, August 2004. Me and my son went on a one-week high-adventure canoe and camping trip on the Missouri River. That's what this video is all about. Pictures of our Boy Scout adventure and interesting facts about the Lewis and Clark expedition 200 years ago. The highlight of the canoe adventure is that we met the Lewis and Clark flotilla, who were celebrating and filming the 200th anniversary of the historic event. In 1802, King Charles of Spain returned the Louisiana Territory to France and revoked America's port access in New Orleans. In 1803, under the threat of war with France over the port access, President Jefferson and James Monroe successfully negotiated a deal with France to purchase the Louisiana Territory, which included about 8,300 square miles for $15 million. Even before negotiations with France were finished, Jefferson asked Congress to finance an expedition to survey the lands of the so-called Louisiana Purchase. The purchase of the Louisiana Territory in 1803 more than doubled the size of the United States. President Thomas Jefferson wanted to have this newly acquired land mapped and explored since most of the territory was considered wilderness. Jefferson wanted to ensure America's claim on the land. The Lewis and Clark expedition began in 1803 when President Thomas Jefferson asked a captain of the U.S. Army, Meriwether Lewis, who was a personal secretary to the president. He asked Meriwether Lewis to explore the lands west of the Mississippi River that would comprise the Louisiana Purchase. Lewis chose William Clark, U.S. Army, as a co-leader for the mission. Even though Clark was once Lewis's superior, Lewis was technically in charge of the trip, but for all intents and purposes the two shared equal responsibility. Lewis and Clark were to search for a water route that would connect the Missouri River with the Pacific Ocean for commerce. Though the expedition did make it to the Pacific, they didn't discover a true water route. The excursion would last over 2 years. Along the way, they confronted harsh weather, unforgiving terrain, treacherous waters, injury, starvation, disease, and both friendly and hostile Native Americans. Nevertheless, the approximately 8,000-mile journey was deemed a huge success and provided new geographic, ecological, and social information about the previously uncharted areas of North America. The Corps produced over 170 valuable maps and geographical information, identified at least 120 new animal species and 200 plant samples, and initiated peaceful relations with dozens of American Indian tribes. The Lewis and Clark expedition made a clear claim for America in the West, in the Louisiana Territory and beyond, and opening the West for further exploring and settlement. They traveled from May 1804 to September 1806. The expedition included 45 men, including Lewis and Clark, plus 75 unmarried soldiers, a contracted boat crew, and a slave owned by Clark named York. Later, a French Indian interpreter and his Indian wife. Preparations for the Lewis and Clark expedition. So Lewis knew that exploring the Louisiana Territory would be no small task, and immediately began preparations. He studied medicine, botany, astronomy, and zoology, and scrutinized existing maps and journals of the region. On July 5, 1804, Lewis visited the arsenal at Harper's Ferry to obtain munitions and guns. He then rowed a custom-made 55-foot keelboat, also called the boat or the barge, down the Ohio River and joined Clark in Clarksville, Indiana. From there they went up to the Missouri River, and then while Lewis collected additional supplies. Lewis entrusted Clark to recruit men for the Corps of Volunteers for the Northwest Discovery. Throughout the winter of 1803-1804, Clark recruited and trained men at Camp Du Bois, just north of St. Louis, Missouri. He chose unmarried, healthy men who were good hunters and knew survival skills. On May 14, 1804, Clark and the Corps joined Lewis in St. Charles, Missouri, and headed upstream on the Missouri River in a keelboat and two smaller boats at the rate of about 15 miles per hour. Heat, swarms of insects, and strong river currents made the trip miserable at best. To maintain discipline, Lewis and Clark ruled the Corps with an iron hand and doled out harsh punishments such as bareback lashing and hard labor for those who got out of line. On August the 20th, one member of the party on the river, Sergeant Charles Floyd, died of an abdominal infection, possibly from appendicitis. He was the only member of the Corps to die on the whole journey. Lewis and Clark developed a first contact protocol for meeting new Indian tribes. They bartered goods and presented the tribe's leader with a Jefferson Indian Peace Medal, a coin engraved with the image of Thomas Jefferson on one side and an image of two hands clasped between a tomahawk and a peace pipe with the inscription, "Peace and Friendship" on the other. They told the Indians that America owned their land and offered military protection in exchange for peace. Some Indians had met white men before and were friendly and open to trade. Others were weary of Lewis and Clark and their intentions and were openly hostile, but though seldom violent. In August, Lewis and Clark held peaceful Indian councils with the Odo near present-day Council Bluffs, Ohio, and later the Yukon Yankton Sioux at Yankton, South Dakota. In late September, however, they encountered the Teton Sioux, who weren't as accommodating and tried to stop the Corps' boats and demanded a toll payment, but they were no match for the military might of the Corps and moved on. In early November, the Corps came across villages of friendly Mandan Indians in North Dakota and decided to set up a camp downriver for the winter along the banks of the Missouri River. Within about 4 weeks, they built a triangular-shaped fort called Fort Mandan. The Corps spent the next 5 months at Fort Mandan hunting, foraging, and making canoes, ropes, leather clothing, and moccasins, while Clark prepared new maps. According to Clark's journal, the men were all in good health overall. While at Fort Mandan, Lewis and Clark met French-Canadian trapper and hired him as an interpreter. They allowed his pregnant Indian wife Sacagawea to join him on the expedition. Sacagawea had been kidnapped by another Rocky Mountain tribe at the age of 12 and then sold to the French fur trader. Lewis and Clark hoped she could help them communicate with Indians they'd encounter on their journey. On February 11, 1805, Sacagawea gave birth to a son. On April 7, 1805, Lewis and Clark sent some of their crew and their keelboat loaded with zoological plant supplies, maps, and reports and letters back down the river to St. Louis. Then Lewis and Clark and the rest of the Corps headed further up the river and streams for the Pacific, over the mountains, and then over the mountains. They crossed through Montana and made their way into the Continental Divide by Lemhi Pass, where, with Sacagawea's help, they purchased horses from Sacagawea's tribe. The group next headed out of Lemhi Pass and crossed the Bitter Root Mountain Range with the help of many horses and a handful of Indian guides. This leg of the journey proved to be the most difficult, as many of them suffered from frostbite, hunger, dehydration, bad weather, freezing temperature, and exhaustion. Still, despite the merciless terrain and conditions, not a single soul was lost. After 11 days, the Corps were over the Rocky Mountains and stumbled upon a tribe of friendly Nez-Perce Indians along Idaho's Clearwater River. The Indians took in the weary travelers, fed them, and helped them regain their health. As the Corps recovered, they built dugout canoes and then left their horses with the Nez-Perce and braved the Clearwater River rapids to Snake River and then to the Columbia River. The Corps finally reached the stormy Pacific Ocean in November 1805. They decided to make camp near present-day Astoria, Oregon, and started building a fort on December 10th and moved in by Christmas. It was not an easy winter at the fort. Everyone struggled to keep themselves and their supplies dry and fought an ongoing battle with tormenting fleas and other insects. Almost everyone was weak and sick with stomach problems, likely caused by bacterial infections, hunger, or influenza-like symptoms. On March 23, 1806, the Corps left Oregon for home. They retrieved their horses from the Nees Pierce and waited until June for the snow to melt to cross the mountains into the Missouri Basin. Lewis's group took a shortcut north to the Great Falls of the Missouri River and explored Maria's River, a tributary of the Missouri in present-day Montana, while Clark's group, including Sacagawea and her family, went south along the Yellowstone River. The two groups planned to rendezvous where the Yellowstone and the Missouri met in North Dakota. On August 12th, Lewis and Clark and their crews reunited and dropped off Sacagawea and her family at the Mandan villages. They then headed down the Missouri River, where the currents were moving in their favor this time, and arrived in St. Louis on September 23rd, where they were received with a hero's welcome. Lewis and Clark returned to Washington, D.C. in the fall of 1806 and shared their experiences with Thomas Jefferson. Both Lewis and Clark received double pay and 1,600 acres of land for their efforts. Lewis was made governor of the Louisiana Territory, and Clark was appointed brigadier general of the militia for Louisiana Territory and a federal Indian agent. Clark remained well respected and lived a successful life. Meriwether Lewis, leader of the expedition, however, was not an effective governor and drank too much. He never married and never had children, and died in 1809 of 2 gunshot wounds, possibly self-inflicted. A few years later, Sacagawea died, and Clark became her children's guardian. Despite Lewis's tragic end, his expedition with Clark remains as one of America's most famous duel. And with the aid of Sacagawea and other Native Americans, they helped strengthen America's claim to the West and inspired countless other explorers and Western pioneers.